All right, so thank you all. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions Literature Review webinar. Today we'll be discussing the literature review. This is normally referred to as Chapter 2. Our model for the dissertation is based on the 5-chapter model, which is pretty typical, but some schools require more chapters. So for you, it might be a different chapter, but just know that generally when I'm referring to Chapter 2, I'll be referring to the literature review. And pretty much across the board, it's made up of the same components. If you do have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we will be sure to answer those. We've also got Brittany on today, and she'll be posting some helpful links or resources in the chat, so please be on the lookout for those. All right, so to begin, the typical components of the literature review generally are the introduction, the literature search strategy, the theoretical framework, the review of the literature, and then the summary. The review of the literature is generally going to be the bulk of the chapter, so we'll talk about that at length today. So a great place to start with your dissertation is to access your school's specific template for the chapters and for the dissertation as a whole. Today, I'll be covering a general template that we have found to seem pretty standard across the board. But as always, your school is going to be the best guide of what is required. So whenever possible, refer to whatever guidelines they have in place. And then this information is just great to supplement that. So just keep that in mind during the presentation today. Again, the elements that I'll talk about today are normally what's required, so we'll get through those. If your school doesn't have any templates, we do have some available on our website, so feel free to check those out. But again, your chair is going to be a very good resource. In addition to a template, you may even be able to ask them for past examples of dissertations or literature review chapters that other students have done. So your chapter will start with an introduction. Here you'll want to reorient the reader about what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. Generally, in each chapter, you'll have that brief section just bringing the reader back to the purpose of your study and to your problem statement. So you'll begin with that. Some ways that you might do this are restating the purpose of your study and then reminding the reader of why it's important that you conduct your study. And then in this section, just like all the other chapters, you'll also go ahead and provide a preview for the chapters that are going to be coming up. Next will come your literature search strategy, or it's also called the methods of searching section. So whichever term you've heard, that is what will come next. Here, your reader is looking to see that you've really cast a wide net and that you've conducted a comprehensive search in doing your research. So this piece will show that you've not missed anything during your literature review, and you have a really good lay of the land of what's already been done and why your study fits into this body of literature. So this will help provide a description to the reader of what you did and that you've reviewed any like seminal or pertinent literature on the topic. So to do this, you're going to want to describe your search technique. This typically isn't a very long section. You can start off by indicating maybe the portal that you used to search, whether you used something like Google Scholar or PubMed, or if you looked through any specific journals, you'll want to indicate that here. You'll also want to include search terms or the combination of search terms that you used. That could be something related to your variables, your major concept, or your theory. So if you are looking to study postpartum depression, it's a good bet that postpartum depression will be involved in your search terms. And then the last part here, including anything that you use to qualify your data. So if you are specifically excluding text that is not in English or specifically excluding articles that don't include full text, you want to make sure that that's very clear here. Date of publication is also very important to consider. So some universities are specific about how recent the articles used can be. So again, refer to your university on those guidelines. But the good rule of thumb is that if a specific article is not foundational to the topic that you're studying, it's better to use more recent articles. And the reason for that is just, wanting to focus on more recent research because it's more topical and still relevant to what you're doing, rather than something that may have been conducted 20 years ago. Probably a lot has changed. So kind of looking in a five, a maximum of a 5-year timeline is a good rule of thumb for your literature search. Hi, Isabella. I see your message in the chat. We will provide a copy of the webinar within 24 to 48 hours. So don't worry, you haven't missed too much, and you'll be caught up once you're able to review it. Yeah, no worries. So if your school does require some kind of limitation on publication years, you'll want to include that in this section to really show that you adhered to that and describe the year range that you used during your search. Peer-reviewed academic articles are the gold standard for literature review. You may also rely on other methods like books or websites, but I would say books should be used sparingly, and then websites should kind of be used very sparingly. A situation where a website might be appropriate is if you are needing statistical information or demographic information about maybe a population of interest or an event that you're talking about in your dissertation. So you could use like government websites or websites of that nature to collect those metrics and to report those metrics. I also recommend during your literature search accessing your university's research library. It's such a great tool. You pretty much have access to a lot of, or typically you'll have access to a lot of open journals. So you won't kind of get stuck behind that paywall where you're only able to read the abstract. So if you're able to access, journals through your school, it's a very helpful tool. Another helpful method is that when you are searching through that university research library is to use the advanced search field. Some of you may have already started your literature search, and I'm sure that what you'll find is it can be very overwhelming. There are a lot of articles out there. So using that advanced search field to really tailor your search is going to be helpful in cutting down some things that may not make sense for you to read at all. So if you're only looking at papers, within the last 5 years, you can use that search field to completely eliminate anything outside of that criteria. Other researchers that I've found helpful, there's a website called connectedpapers.com. It's a visual tool that creates a graph of papers according to their similarity and connects papers that cite each other or have overlapping citations. They also look at papers with related subject matter. So different tools like that might help kind of make this large task feel a little bit smaller by decreasing the scope of your search. I also recommend taking advantage of your university research librarian. If you are able to, they are, filled with a wealth of knowledge, and they're a really good tool as well if you're able to. Again, the literature search strategy section is not very long, but it's basically an instruction manual for everything that you did to complete your search. If you are hoping to have a reference for your literature review, again, you might want to just reach out to your chair and ask them for samples. You can also refer to ProQuest, the website. They have sample dissertations on there as well, just if you want to see an example before you get started. The next step is going to be your theoretical framework. Typically, you'll mention your theoretical framework in chapter 1, and then you'll provide a more elaborate discussion about it during chapter 2 here. So here you will clearly state the theory that you're using, discuss who developed the theory, and then also why they developed it. You'll also want to define the theory and discuss what researchers have used the theory for in the past. So again, all of this is going to come up in your literature search. It's common that you'll see these theories duplicated throughout various papers. So you'll just want to make note of that and really be able to report back and connect the dots of, what has this been used for over time. Once you have all of that set up, then you will want to connect the theory to your study. So typically what we see is that conceptual frameworks are associated with qualitative studies and theoretical frameworks are generally associated with quantitative studies. And that's because the nature of them. So, surveys and established measures that are typically used in quantitative papers are based in theoretical foundations. So if you're using a specific survey, if you are doing a quantitative study, if you're using a specific instrument, you'll just want to make sure that you're citing the appropriate papers. So, if you're using an instrument that was designed by Smith, when you're citing that, you don't want to use maybe a secondary paper by Jones or something. You'll want to go back and really connect that measure to the original paper. And then for qualitative studies, since they are exploratory, there is always a theory that will kind of encapsulate, or I'm sorry, excuse me, there isn't always a theory that will get at the exact concept that you're studying. So you can use these theoretical frameworks to kind of just connect to your study. It might not be exactly what you're studying, but kind of pulling from those different literature sources to build the rationale for why this framework connects best to what you're looking at. Okay, so review of the literature. This slide again is this section is going to be the meat of your chapter. It's going to be about 80 to 85% of your chapter. You're going to have a lot of information from the studies that you've pulled, and a part of the challenge here is going to be figuring out how to organize all of these materials in a way that will make sense to your reader, and also a lot of times make sense to yourself. So part of the purpose of the literature review is not only to show what has been done on the topic to date, but also to make an argument for your study and to highlight your research problem. So in general, the best way to go about this is to really orient this section in a way that is going to be highlighting these gaps, but also bolstering support for why your study needs to be conducted. So in order to do this, part of the process is summary, and then part of it is also analysis and evaluation. So you'll want to make the case for your study by, again, highlighting those gaps and doing some literature critique to show why your study is important. So that might look like when you're discussing one particular study, saying, well, this study looked at these 3 variables, but they seem to be missing this 4th variable that I think has meaning. And that's why in my study, I'm going to be exploring this 4th variable more in depth. So really, identifying what the need is and identifying how your work is going to be filling that need. As far as organizing this section goes, it can be organized by different headers based on your concepts, and then using subsections within that. It's a little difficult to anticipate what that's going to look like for each specific paper because throughout your search, different concepts and different topics will come up. So it's difficult to, foresee what that will be, but essentially you'll use the subsections to highlight each specific facet that's being discussed in the context of your topic. So again, I'll go with my postpartum depression example. If you are studying postpartum depression and throughout your literature search, it comes up that, I don't know, something like workplace environment is really heavily weighted and really discussed in the literature, that might be a subsection that goes under, where you're going to talk a little bit more about how those two are connected. Okay, and then the next piece is synthesis. So when you're writing about the literature, again, it is a mix of this synthesis, analysis, and summary. So here we're referring to combining information from studies to make your point. So the best way to think about this and organize this is on a paragraph level. So again, it's very easy to be overwhelmed because of all the information that you have. So I always recommend just reverting back to the basics of what you know about, organizing a paragraph. So remembering that the paragraph will start with a topic sentence, then you will talk about the evidence that discusses and illustrates the topic, and then you'll go into summary, a summary sentence, and then transition into the next sentence. So really just thinking about it just on a paragraph level. Don't think of this huge, large picture, kind of outline your headings and then take it one paragraph at a time in order to kind of get this really clear picture of each article that you have already read and why it's important and what's missing. So here's just an example of synthesis. I'm not going to read out this paragraph, but I do want to point out some elements that are important. So again, we have the topic sentence highlighted in yellow, and then in green, we have the evidence or discussion related to the topic sentence. And then in blue, we're getting into that summary and transition. So again, just really making sure that bare bones, these elements are a part of each paragraph that you have, and this will be a strong foundation to build your dissertation upon. I also want to highlight the use of qualifying words peppered throughout the paragraph. So in the beginning, you'll see we say recent research has mostly shown. And then again, in the end, we say research largely supports. So that's getting at that synthesis piece, right? We're not pulling out one article or two. We're kind of pulling together a summary statement of, okay, a good amount of these articles say this. And at the same time, we do want to highlight and call out articles that might be outliers. So if, 9 out of 10 articles say that workplace environment or a negative workplace environment is a big factor for women coming back to the workforce and causing, or, is associated with postpartum depression, but you might want to say, but there is one article that says that this variable might be more heavily weighted. So again, just finding those brief statements that show that you are, combining these articles and synthesizing them in a way that makes sense to the reader. So we've already discussed analysis and evaluation a little bit. Again, this chapter 2 is not purely informational. We do want to tell the reader what studies have been conducted and what they found, but we also want to make sure to note the trends and gaps in research. And we also want to highlight, if there's any opportunity to do so, the importance to focus on what your study will be focusing on, because it's not already present in the literature. So making sure that you are emphasizing that your efforts are not duplicating what's out there, but are rather adding to the body of literature. Where you can, you should also reiterate the research problem, and this will ultimately culminate in an argument for conducting your study. And then lastly, you'll want to get into the summary. So here you will just recap the major points of the chapter by reminding the reader of your research problem based on all the research that you've reviewed. And again, importantly, what is missing in the research. And here you'll again just be reiterating the need for your study. So why it's important. So again, it's, we started with doing that and you're kind of pulling it through all the way through this literature review section, really the whole time, just reminding the reader why your study is going to be important. So that does conclude our session for today. I do want to remind you all that here at Statistics Solutions, we do provide full service dissertation consulting. So if you feel like you might benefit from a more one-on-one session or, some level of consulting, please feel free to reach out to us using the contact information on the screen or any of the links that have been posted in the chat already. But I will open it up for Q&A now. So please feel free to pop questions in the chat if you have any. Yes, I will add the contact information in the chat. Okay, let's see here. So we've got some questions coming in. Teresa, how long is the introduction? For this chapter 2, so this literature review, I would say a good rule of thumb is about 25 to 30 pages on average. But again, I would refer you to your chair just in case they have different expectations. But from what I've seen, that's generally how long this section is. Okay, Kendra, 5 years. What if your papers are all 10 to 15 years old? Well, I would try to include some more recent papers because things may have changed over time. So I would do that just to make sure that what you're basing the need for your study on is on, the most up-to-date research. Now, if you can't find any papers that are more recent, then of course that's a different thing. But if there are some available, I would refer to them. And also, again, just checking in to make sure that your chair or your committee doesn't expect a more recent literature review. Okay. Yoni, the webinar will be sent out between 24 and 48 hours. So although you missed the beginning, you will be able to review it if you'd like. Oh, okay, I see. Barbara did not receive the linear regression webinar. It looks like Brittany mentioned that you should receive a copy, but I'll post the link in the chat to our webinar archive because it might be there as well, and you can review that. Just give me, or Brittany, if you could help me just post the chat to the webinar archive, that would be helpful. Okay, Kendra, recent papers are not as relevant, so trying to decide if it's better to use older articles or more recent and less. I think a mix is probably what you're going to end up with, because ultimately, you determine what's most relevant to your study. So it may be helpful, to include those recent ones, but it's just going to depend on what you're looking at studying. Okay, I see a question from Isabella. If you sign up for a webinar but didn't make it, will we still receive a link? I will refer to Brittany on that one. Tahani, I see that you've asked a question about frameworks. So the theoretical framework is typically going to be based on existing theories, whereas the conceptual framework is something that you can develop yourself based on theories. So typically the theoretical framework is more linked to a quantitative study because like surveys or validated measures that are used are typically kind of already set in stone, especially if they're validated. Whereas if you're looking at a qualitative study, you might be mixing multiple concepts, and that's why that would be more appropriate for a conceptual framework. Does that answer your question, Tani? Okay, great. And again, if you have, more questions or more detailed questions or would like to specifically talk about, what you're studying, please do feel free to reach out to us directly, and we can kind of troubleshoot as well. Sharonda, as far as the word count goes, it is going to vary based on person, based on what you are studying. 25 to 30 is just an average of kind of what I've seen. So I don't want to say, a hard stop, you should aim for 25. It's just going to depend on, what you're looking at. So let's see here. And yes, it will expand once you start researching, because you'll probably be writing, a paragraph for each article that you have found. So it really does, it really turns out longer than you would expect it to. And also remember that you're going to include an introduction, you're going to include discussion about your framework, and you're going to include, your research questions, your problem statement. So a lot of that eats up that page count as well. I'll go back to the components here, but a lot of this stuff in the beginning will take up some space there in terms of pages. Does that answer your question, Sharonda? Okay, I'm glad. Okay, Kristen, how many sources are usually expected? Well, typically for myself, I pull about 30 articles, and that's kind of my starting point. I wouldn't say to shoot for a number, but rather it's really the quality. So if there's, a lot of foundational work on the topic, that's great to include. But really just looking at the quality of the studies that you're using. If some of them are really overlapping, or like if 4 articles are kind of saying the same thing, then you don't need to include all of those. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'd say really getting at that quality as opposed to a number. And then of course the caveat of that is your chair might have a rule for how many numbers they want. So just checking in on those guidelines. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I will hang out for a few more minutes, but if you don't have any questions, thank you all for joining today. How much time should you allot to writing this section? How much time do you have? It depends on, maybe like how much time you're writing each day. I'd say maybe a week on just pulling your articles, and then maybe 2 weeks on organizing the section. I think that's a good goal. But there is no, right or wrong answer. If you have a good amount of time, I would use it. But I would say 3 weeks, you could probably pull together a strong literature review. And, given, your dissertation isn't the only thing you're doing, right? You probably have a life. So it just really depends on your lifestyle. What's a life? Yes, I feel that. Okay, Kristen, should you start with this chapter or do you need to write an order? You don't need to write an order, but I wouldn't go past this chapter, if that makes sense. Like you can start with chapter 1 and then go on to your literature review, but I wouldn't go starting with like your data analysis before you do your literature review, because this is really going to inform all of the procedures for your project. I don't know if you're doing like a quant or qual study, but this is going to inform possible interview questions if you're doing a qualitative study, or it'll inform what instruments are best to use in a survey. So I do recommend not starting anything past chapter 2 before doing chapter 2, if that makes sense. Okay. Would developing a chart summarizing the studies be helpful? Yes, absolutely. I'd say pop it in Excel and make some headers like title, citation, main points. What else? What are some other, maybe a link as well, because once you start doing this, it's going to be like a mess of articles. So if you can keep the link or the PDF as well, that would be very helpful. You might also include framework in there so that you can have a quick snapshot of what each article was talking about. But yeah, definitely whatever methods you can use to organize these articles, like in one document, will make this process easier. Can I use many of the same articles used for my proposal? Yes, that is absolutely appropriate. And one thing too, that we recommend in the literature search is after you've reviewed each article, maybe just write a brief paragraph summarizing that article. This will help later when you're putting everything together. I know it can be daunting to think about, your word count or how many pages you need to get to, but having that brief article to just edit can be very helpful. Any other questions? All right. Well, again, thank you all for joining. I'm going to end the webinar now. Thank you. Have a great day.